right, welcome back to another episode of Modern Cyber. As usual, I am your host, Jeremy, and I have a guest today who brings a unique perspective on some of the work that she has done in over more than 20 years of work at the intersection of, well, I'll let her sum it up because we're going to get into a lot of what her work has entailed. I'm delighted to be joined today by Leslie Daigle. Leslie has been working at the intersection of technology, business, economics, and policy to drive effective change for more than 20 years. She's currently the Chief Technical Officer and Director of the Internet Integrity Program at the Global Cyber Alliance, GCA, furthering GCA's development and deployment of global solutions that contribute to eradicating cyber risk. She is also the principal at Thinking Cat Enterprises, as well as the co-founder and co-host of the Tech Sequences podcast, and we're definitely going to talk about that as well, which explores the many facets of internet technology along with its intended and sometimes unintended consequences. Leslie holds a Master's of Science in Computing and Information Systems from the University of Guelph and a Bachelor of Science in Math and Computer Science from McGill University. Leslie, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on Modern Cyber.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, I want to start off by getting into some of what it means to be kind of at that intersection that was described in the intro there. When we think about the intersection of technology and business and economics and policy, I think all of us, we don't really think about our jobs and our lives being impacted by all of those things on a regular basis. But I guess, how do you think about that intersection and what does it mean for you?
Yeah, well, it's as you noted in my intro, my background is chiefly in technology. I mean, I got into computers because I liked pushing buttons and seeing what happened. So I'm as fond of a technology puzzle as the next person is. But you know, one of my favorite sayings is that a product is not a technology is not a product. A product is a solution for somebody else's problem. So you have to understand the other perspective in order to build something that's useful and usable. And so in the context of trying to solve internet security problems or get technologies deployed in the internet at all, it's not enough to just come up with, here's the next best standard. You also have to understand what are the ramifications in terms of the business, what are the ramifications in terms of, potential policy interests, so on and so forth.
And when you think about bringing those other two facets in there, let's say the economic side and the policy side of it, I guess on the economic side, part of it is that like you may have a solution to a problem, and it might be, to your point, it might be somebody else's problem that needs solving. But if it's economically unsound to do so, that's also not really a solution.
It isn't, or it's that itself is a problem you have to solve. So, I mean, diving right into an example. Routing security is a problem that has faced the internet for, a few decades. And the problem with trying to solve, so routing security meaning that all networks that participate to create the internet have to agree on sharing packets between them. That's how you can reach one end to the other of the internet. And they do that by advertising how to connect from one to the other. And that's a route. And routing security really includes the notion of, how do I believe you that you can send my packet from me to that other network? And how do I know that you're not going to, send it via China or via some other country that I don't want to deal with? So the problem in that case is that, I as a network operator cannot in fact create routing security. I can only do extra work that will improve the security of the overall internet. So that's a case where everybody has to do a little bit. It's going to cost them something, but everybody has to do their little bit in order to ensure that the whole internet can become more secure.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You bring up an example there, and I spent some time living in Asia, and TCP/IP routing is really one of those things where, like, it's so funny. I mean, this takes me back to the very, very beginning of my career. But I came out of school with my little bachelor's in linguistics and got thrown into the deep end of technology. And there were two courses that I took at the time. And one was on Windows NT networking and administration. And the other one was on TCP/IP. And I so often end up coming back to TCP/IP principles. How does a network work? What does a subnet mask mean? What does a route table do? How does traffic get routed? And so often it's a little bit like the DNS haiku. It's these like core fundamental problems of things that either get, broken through an unintended consequence of a network change or whatever. But part of the reason I bring up that experience that I had living in Asia was that in Asia, that the the TCP/IP infrastructure, which I guess really kind of mirrors the internet backbone there, is really broken. And the peering arrangements between the providers are, I think, kind of fundamentally screwed up from an economics and incentives perspective. And we would see consistently when I was living in Singapore, every day around 4 o'clock, the two main providers in Singapore would start sending domestic traffic via third-party countries. And it was, I'm pretty sure, I never got full confirmation on this, I'm pretty sure it was because of some kind of peering arrangement where, as long as we're roughly even, we just kind of call it clean and, gentleman's handshake kind of thing. But as soon as one side is sending more traffic to the other or receiving more from the other, then like economics come into play. But you bring up something there, and what you said about the risk side of it is that, if you're getting routed via a third country, you don't have a guarantee that there's not somebody trying to sniff that traffic or maybe understand what's going on in there, right?
Yeah. And, we saw that a little bit too when there was the revelations, the Snowden revelation, 10, 12 years ago, where it was revealed that the US was in fact looking at metadata on network traffic and, painting a picture of who was talking to whom about, maybe not about what, but at least who was talking to whom. A lot of South American countries said, fine, we need a better route to get to Europe that does not pass through Miami.
Through the US. Yeah.
Yeah. So it is real. And so I guess the summary point is that you can't look at the internet purely as a technology play. You can't look at improvements purely from the standpoint of, what's the right chalkboard way to solve this problem. You have to look at things like, what are the economics? What are the political plays?
Yeah, this really dovetails nicely into the three kind of, I think it's described here as the three building blocks of the internet that the Global Cyber Alliance leverages in terms of, I think, the work that you guys are doing, right? So what I've got here is names, numbers, and routes, trust in the domain name space, fighting malicious unwanted traffic, and enhancing routing security. First, I guess, talk to us a little bit about the GCA as a whole, and then I'd love to hear more about those three things, why you picked those three things, and what you guys have learned in the work that you've done in those areas.
Sure, that'll be quick.
Okay.
So the Global Cyber Alliance is a not-for-profit organization that's focused on improving cybersecurity for everybody on the internet. And we sort of divide the work into three spaces. One space is working with all the other organizations, not-for-profits focused in working in the internet space. There's a part of the organization that's focused on, toolkits and building out solutions for individuals and small businesses at scale. And then there's my part of the organization, which is focused on internet integrity, which is looking at trying to improve the state of cybersecurity of the internet in a way that leaves us with one internet, a whole internet that's has integrity, is not carved up into little islands of, separate space by overuse of blocking and whatnot. So when we look at the underpinnings of the internet's infrastructure, the names, numbers, and routes, we look at it from the standpoint of, each of these things is the underpinning of a number of different types of cybersecurity threats. Things like domain names. Abuse of domain names is at the heart of a lot of phishing attempts. Things like, we have a global honey farm. We've had a global honey farm for over 5 years that looks at, what are the attacks on IoT devices, and we can tell where they're coming from. We can tell which are the most polluting networks. We can tell which are the most polluting IP addresses. If we can tell, so can others. And we look at it from the standpoint of, how can we work with the networks that are hosting these polluters to say, why don't you stop it before it ever leaves your network? And then we can remove the pollution in the internet before it actually becomes an actionable problem. So sorry?
And I was just going to say, and that's kind of by partnering with the ISPs and, let's say, the hosting providers and the cloud providers, and, hey, you've got a very, very suspect domain that looks like, instead of brandname.com, it's brand-name.com as a kind of a typo squatted, phony domain. Okay.
And going after it on a case by case basis is prohibitive, right? I mean, there's as fast as you can dream up a solution, there are malicious actors out there that will do something really horrible and route around you. So, for instance, with the routing security example, that was a project started at the Internet Society 10 years ago that focus is on working with network operators who know they want to do something about improving the state of routing security and saying, great, let us help you work together and solve the problem. So for the malicious unwanted traffic, it's a question of what is an appropriate amount of this nonsense for you to let out of your network, and how can we help you figure out what are industry best practices to stop it? And that's the way that we think works to create, a solution at scale. And our fundamental thesis is you cannot, you can't 2FA your way out of an internet that has broken routing security, right? I mean, there's no point in putting a lovely big brass lock on a paper house. So that's why we're going to the source, if you will.
But now I'm super curious about all three of these aspects, right? Because just as you said, you can't do this one-off, right? There's billions of domain names being registered, and I don't know what the actual number is, but probably millions a day is probably safe to say around the world, or at least hundreds of thousands, right? And at the same time, there's, I don't know how many network routing changes happening per day based on things like traffic volumes and, let's say, like, BGP for failover or maintenance efforts or whatnot. So how do you think about, let's say, like, policy aligned around that? Because it's very easy for me to just say, well, block all AS numbers associated to threat actors, right? If it were as simple as that, I think we would have solved this problem decades ago, right? But I know that's not really how it works. So I guess, how do you think about either partnering with companies to give them guidance around this, or issuing policy statements and documents that provide best practices and guidance around these challenges?
Yeah. So I think a couple of things there. One, that whole notion of block everything that comes out of AS is associated with bad actors is exactly what leads to an internet that does not have integrity, that's sort of a flimsy, shredded up old thing. I mean, I think our aim is to try to get solutions out there so that most of the problem is solved before blocking is the only answer. But in terms of the, how do you approach this? It's really a question of, instead of us writing up notes on what you should do, because we don't have network, we are not running part of the domain name system. Instead of us telling you what you should do, it's us being able to convene groups of people who really want to do something with their networks and others, and saying, what do you think are the right things to do? What can you do? And again, routing security is a great example, because 10 years ago, there were standards being developed that would solve the whole problem, end-to-end security of the routing system. The only problem was that network operators said that I cannot implement that in my network. It is computationally infeasible for me to do that in my routers. My backhaul networks cannot do that at line speed. So I can't do that. It's a lovely, lovely thing you worked up. So that was the context in which we brought people together and said, what can you do? And then once you get what can you do, then you make a list and you say, well, this is the sort of thing that other network operators think that they can do. Who wants to sign up to do this? And that's what created the MANRS actions, the mutually agreed norms for routing security. And we have almost 1,000 networks signed up saying that they are, in fact, operating in consistently with the MANRS actions. And that's how you get the industry to focus on what the industry can do.
Interesting. I just found this manrs.org, MANRS.org, for those that are interested, and we'll link that from the show notes as well. So that's interesting. So this is a community of presumably kind of telcos, ISPs, and similar providers who are kind of signing up for this program, opting in, so to speak, and then doing what they can do.
Yes.
Does it feel like whack-a-mole?
It would be if we were going after all the problem children, but it feels a lot more constructive if we're actually creating momentum in the industry to say, okay, this is what you said you can do, and you're doing it. What would you like to do next? How can we all get to a better place? I mean, I'm old enough that I know that that's how the internet itself was built, right? I mean, the internet was built as a collaborative effort of networks talking to other networks and spanning the globe. So I think I see it as really sort of amplifying that approach and continuing the whole approach to trying to solve problems.
If I'm trying to think about, let's say, an analogy to it to help me wrap my own mind around it, and maybe some of the audience as well, is it kind of like, hey, we've got roads and they take you from anywhere to anywhere, roughly speaking. And on our roads, we kind of have agreed upon norms of like, what are speed limits? And what does it mean if there is a traffic sign that says no left turn here or things like that? There are these kind of safety guides that, to your point, they're not going to try to stamp out every speeder on the road or every reckless or dangerous driver on the road, but they're going to establish this kind of like baseline agreed upon set of how traffic should work. Is that kind of an analogy?
I think that's pretty good. I might push it a little bit to thinking
Okay.
about maps and thinking
Okay.
about, or even thinking about, your navigation map that says, I'm going to get you from where you are now to where you want to go. It's like, and do you believe it?
Yeah.
Do you believe
Yeah.
it's not going to try to route you through some farmer's field? Because, in the
Right.
early
Right.
days, Google Maps did try to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's more that making sure that we are all agreed about what is a route from where I am to where I want to go, and that you're not gonna, like I said, route me through a farmer's field or send commercial traffic up a tiny road.
Yeah. Yeah. I can definitely kind of identify with that. I drove with a disconnected GPS, a TomTom device at the time, in around like 2008 to 2011 timeframe in Australia and New Zealand. And, these were not self-updating maps. These were maps that you downloaded updates for every so
Right.
often. And we definitely got routed through the forests here and there and on some unpaved roads and on some roads where, like, thankfully we didn't get stuck. And we didn't know any better. We're following the guidance of the GPS device. So that's really interesting. I thanks for the clarification on that. This is really interesting. And when it comes to DNS, this is something where I know that there are actually companies that are actively building, for-profit businesses
Mm-hmm.
on the back of just like, hey, I'm going to monitor your brands and domain name registrations that are either affiliated with your brands or look like they are attempting to be affiliated with your brands. What are some of the solutions or some of the policies and thoughts that you are providing there from the GCA, or some of the guidance that you provide to people there?
Sure, and I think that kind of commercial approach is probably going to remain necessary from the standpoint of sort of brand protection stuff and
Yep.
making sure that everybody's interests are well taken care of. The question on our mind really starts from the standpoint of, once you've identified that a domain it was registered for criminally malicious purposes or has been taken over and is being used for criminally malicious purposes, how do you handle it? And what's the best operating practice at that level? Because for a number of reasons, it's been pretty hard to get registries and registrars to take domains out of the registry. So to take them out of the DNS. I mean, you can say, look, here's this address that's only being used to sell counterfeit, or harmful
Viagra
products.
or whatever.
Yeah, whatever. It's like you really need to take it down. And there is another case where you're right back at the economics of it, right? Because you're asking a company to refuse service to one of its customers, which is 100% against its business interests. So how can you get around that problem? And you don't get around it on a one-off basis. You have to take the step back and say, let's show you just how much problematic domain name registration exists in the world, and let's make sure that everybody understands that this is not tens per day. This is hundreds of thousands of domain names being registered per day for malicious purposes. How do you focus on identifying them and then saying, this is a real problem and you need to do something, and so create an industry norm so that a registrar doesn't say, look, if I do this, you're not going to solve the problem, because they're just going to go to my competitor and then they're going to get the money. I'll have lost the business. So that's where you really have to get all the industry lined up together to say, we know there's a problem, we know we have to deal with it, and this is what we'll do.
And I know this isn't something that you kind of provided in the background information that got sent over before we recorded today's episode, but I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on it. I was reading a book recently, and I can't remember which one it was, but it talked about some of the challenges around kind of the gray area of hosting online and what was often referred to as bulletproof hosters, who are in countries where, let's say, like intellectual protection, intellectual property protection laws are not as strong, brand name protection laws are not as strong. And so, registering something close to or one off. And then also, let's say, just from the standpoint of like what can and cannot be sold or provided as a service may also be very different in that in that territory. So things like, let's say, wares or pirated movies and things like that. The Pirate Bay famously was going to be hosted on this offshore platform off the coast of England, right, where no laws or no internet, UK or international law applied to it. Is that still a real common problem that we're facing on the modern internet?
Yeah, it's still a problem. And I mean, so I would bring up 3 points in regards to that. One, the fact that the internet itself doesn't recognize jurisdictional boundaries, which is a good thing because it means that it's, uniform and global. But at the same time, we have to respect the sovereignty of different regions and that they have the right to both protect their own citizens plus also have their own approaches to the legal system. And then 3, that these bad actors can be, registering a domain name in one jurisdiction, living in another jurisdiction entirely, and then hosting, to your point, in a third jurisdiction altogether. So from a legal standpoint, it's really hard to track them down and do something about it. And by the way, who gets to pull the plug on the domain if the content is hosted somewhere else? I mean, that has played out in the domain name system for years. But that is the sort of the nature of the challenge. And I argue that the solution on that front has to be multifaceted as well. The right level of policies to make sure that there is a global understanding of intellectual property and agreement with upholding some level of agreement of what's theft of what's copyright theft, what is piracy, and dealing with it, and then everything else can follow. But it is complex.
Remind me, I think there was a dispute. I'm sure you would have tracked this a lot closer than I was. Wasn't there a dispute a few years ago about either the hosting or kind of the management of, I can't remember if it was either the base ASIN numbers or maybe it was around the root routers for a lot of the IP space, and how in the end the US government wanted to maintain control for a variety of reasons. Is that ringing a bell with you? It brings a few things to mind, and I'm thinking it might have been around the whole notion of the root of the DNS and who actually controls it. Yes, I think that's what it was. And the top of the domain name system, the very, very tippy top of the whole tree of top level domains and all the things, is managed by ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, and that was set up. As a joint effort when the initial standards organization and the initial researchers who built the internet realized that this whole thing was getting too commercial and international and political. So that was created in the late 90s. The challenge was it was operated as on a contract from the U.S. government, from the Department of Commerce. So a lot of countries still felt that the U.S. government still controlled the whole internet, right? So how do I know I'm in country X? How do I know that the U.S. government isn't going to go to war with me and decide that they're going to take me right off the internet by taking my country code out of the domain? Which, of course, it's a war up and down, never would do and never did do. But then, within the last 10 years, there was a push to really, really cut that cord of the last tie to the Department of Commerce, and that was a successful effort. ICANN is now an independent organization that is not tied to the U.S. government. It is still a corporation with a home base in a jurisdiction, of course. But there was some concern, both for and against, whether that should in fact transpire. Yeah. All right. So we've talked about the domain name space. We've talked about traffic. We've talked about routing. Are those the three pillars of internet integrity in your mind, or is there more that we need to think about as well?
I think those are the key. Those are the key from the standpoint of how do we make this internet thing work at its very basic level. There are, of course, many other challenges, and cyber criminal challenges at higher levels. Whether it's looking at the dangers of phishing itself, whether it's looking at content on online platforms, etc. They're very real and also need real solutions. Everything from malware distribution to disinformation. But from our standpoint, again, it's if we're going to look at the very basic level and make sure we have a foundation to build on, that's where we start.
Okay. And how does measurement factor into this? Because that's one of the things that I know got mentioned to me that GCA actually spent some time and energy focusing on. And I'm really interested to hear, because I think a lot of people would approach these problems and say, okay, boom, it's policy, it's opt-in, we've got a community, great. Where does the measurement factor in?
So I think you have to begin and end with measurement is kind of is the real answer there. So I mentioned before that we have this global honey farm, and we can tell you who are the bad actors, and over a period of time who's persistently a bad actor, and we use that not to name and shame because we don't find that to be very constructive, but really just be able to put concrete numbers around the fact that this is a real problem, right? This is the background radiation on the internet is not, small.
Zero.
It's pretty large, and clearly there are some networks who know how to address this stuff because we're not seeing stuff from them. So we can paint a very concrete picture, by geography or by network, as you like, to say here's where the problems are, and this is the size of the problem, and that's useful in getting that agreement that there is a problem here that needs to be solved. And then we do it at the end as well. So in the MANRS activity, there's an observatory that shows, are those networks that said that they were going to do those actions, are they in fact doing them? And we can measure it and say, yes, they are, or here's a network that's having a problem. By the way, you're having a problem. Did you want to fix this? And the level of MANRS readiness, we call it, which networks are actually able to do the right things, is a metric that gets used by other parties to say the state of routing security is improving. So it's important to not just if we were going to just run around and talk about all the things we think are problems, we'd be here all day. So we stay focused on the ones that we can actually show objectively. Here's the challenge. And what can we do to improve it?
Yeah. It's really interesting. What you mentioned there is kind of funny because as you said it, you start and end with measurement. There's a saying that I'm sure you've heard at some point, what gets measured gets rewarded, or what gets measured gets investment, right? And I think that's very true, and especially in corporate America. But I don't know that I've ever thought about it from the perspective of like more holistic programs across the internet, especially when they're opt-in programs. But I do definitely get that these things, if you have a measurable impact on the reduction of a certain type of undesired behavior, that's a really strong indicator that the program is actually delivering value, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. I'm curious about a couple of other things, right? So you've been at this for a little while, and you've got more than 2 decades in your career at, again, this intersection of all of these forces. I'm kind of curious about what are the challenges that you've seen evolve over time and the biggest challenges that you see that we're facing today?
Yeah, so I think, one of the biggest things that I would say has changed in the last, and I probably need to change 20 years because it's probably been a bit longer than that now. Anyway, I think one of the biggest things is just scale. The scale of what we're dealing with now is entirely different than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And that's, both pluses and minuses. The internet was constructed because it wasn't technically or frankly operationally feasible to build one network that spanned the globe. So that's why you have an internetwork of networks working together. And now there are companies that have globe spanning networks, right? The major tech companies don't need to rely on other companies' networks because they have their own. Thank you very much. And that's great and excellent, but it also means it changes the playing field a little bit and distracts us a bit from that spirit of collaboration, right? That it makes it harder to bring people to the table and say, no, we really do all have to play together to make one fabric for the whole thing. And at the same time, the scale of attacks and the scale of, you know, what kinds of things are being tried. And this is this is not about, little miscreant high schoolers just playing in their basements with it when their parents are still at work. Really, this is about organized teams of miscreants in all over the world who have as sophisticated tools as anybody else to do their work, which is to say, perpetrate ransomware or other phishing attempts or any other kind of malware distribution. So scale is probably the biggest thing in terms of the changing landscape.
Yeah. And it sounds like also, just the fact that you mentioned teens getting into stuff, the ease of doing bad stuff has probably come down quite a lot as well. I mean, I remember setting up our first data center, and it was so hard back then, and like you, I should probably update, how many years I've been working in tech to be accurate about it. A couple of other questions that I've got for you as we kind of wrap up this episode, but one of them is, I read something somewhere that, something along the lines of what we know as the internet really represents, and when I say that, I think about, let's say, like websites or back-end services for powering the mobile apps that we use or the entertainment that we use or whatever it is. But all of that together comprises maybe half of what's actually out there. And that there are, deeper level systems and the dark web and things like that. Do you have any sense that you can share with me and with our audience about like how big in kind of air quotes is the dark web relative to kind of the exposed internet? And do you guys track that and spend time looking at it?
Yeah, sadly, I don't have any concrete data there. We don't spend a lot of time tracking that. The thing that I would say is that, most of my life has been focused on trying to make sure that we could continue to have the ability to have networks that are not just part of, the entertainment industry or the, the content delivery world, that the ability to have, distribute our own cat videos. And you can probably hear my cat is having opinions now. So the ability to create new spaces and continue to just have new services pop up is kind of key, I think, to having an internet with diversity going forward. But I think part of the challenge too is that what exactly constitutes the dark web? Is it individual websites that are trading on credit card numbers and other services for hire, or is it something that's like a secondary network that is shadowing the real one? The more we can take care of challenges in the internet we know of, the fewer places there will be for miscreants to hide. And there we go. You can have
there we go. Guest appearance on today's podcast. I don't know if you want to shout out your cat or your cat's Instagram. Feel free to if you like. But, in all seriousness, I want to change gears for a second. Talk to us about the Tech Sequences podcast.
Yeah, so that was something that I started with Alexa Rod in early 2020. She and I both have worked for, however long it has been in the internet, and have watched as individual technologies have sort of come and gone, have been great things, and have had, have been very wildly successful at something that they were intended to, and then had unintended consequences on the side. So we thought it'd be fun to put together a podcast on that topic. Awesome. So we are not quite at 100 episodes over the last 5 years, but closing in on 100 episodes. And we invite guests to talk about different topics. We've talked about AI. We've talked about the episode we published recently was on wearables and the impact they may have on healthcare. So lots of fun topics.
Awesome. And we will have that link from the show notes as well. Was there any episode in particular that, let's say, you've got a fun story from or a great lesson learned? Because I think for me, having hosted now, I think we're roughly about 50 episodes of Modern Cyber as well. I always tell people the most rewarding aspect of it is the things that I learned from the guests that have come on here. And I'm kind of like, I actually have gained more out of hosting the podcast than probably our audience has. So any stories to share or any like really fun lessons learned from hosting?
Yeah, I think that probably the most interesting work that I would pull from it is the discussions around mis and disinformation, and just in the whole way it's been systematized and is being used to drive our world, our real reality, has been just it was eye-opening to hear all the challenges in terms of what's being how that's being perpetrated, and also the challenges in trying to address it. It's a big space.
Yeah, awesome. There's a couple episodes here just to highlight for the audience here: authenticity and post-truth in the digital age, AI's threat to election integrity. I think those are on that topic. I'm sure there are other episodes in there as well. And like I said, we'll have that linked from the show notes. Leslie, I've really enjoyed today's conversation. I really love going back to some of these first principles and a little bit of nostalgia, thinking back to again those early TCP/IP training days, and maybe some not really like PTSD, but some negative memories of managing domain names in bind, and the kind of constant thing of, oh, you missed the period at the end of a line in a particular DNS record, or you forgot to update the serial number of the bind file when you published your change. I think you've probably been through some of these as well, some of these battle scars.
Absolutely.
I love kind of, getting back to some of these principles. I guess just any closing thoughts for our audience, and also anything you'd like to share, any links or anything you'd like to plug from your work at the GCA or anything else.
Yeah, I think I keep plugging the internet as a very constructive force in our world, as long as we keep, being creative and constructive with it. And, I invite everybody to have a look at the globalcyberalliance.org website and see all the good work we're doing there.
Awesome. Well, we will have links to the Global Cyber Alliance, as well as the Tech Sequences podcast, MANRS. Leslie Daigle, thanks you so much for taking the time to join us on Modern Cyber.